All right. What we're going to be looking at here is the introduction to the Holocaust. We are now moving to the point where we're going to be starting to discuss the Holocaust, and we're going to be looking at how all of our elements of eugenics has made this possible. And you'll be able to see both immigration policies, the cases against feeble mindedness and genetic issues, the desire to make a better world, all of that comes into play. So, of course, Holocaust means sacrifice by fire. It was the systematic, bureaucratic, state sponsored persecution of and murder of approximately 6 million Jews, as well as other non Jewish victims by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. We're not really sure of the amount of non Jewish victims, mostly because the T4 program, which we'll be talking about, is very questionable of the amount there. Some say 20,000, some say 200,000. So it depends on how you count and who you count. So this brings about the beginning of the word genocide, which is the crime of destroying a group of people because of their ethnic, national, racial, or religious identity. Now we know. Let me see if I can get myself in the right position here. My camera and I are having issues. We know that America has been involved with this for a while. We haven't just gone after the subjugation of certain groups, such as African Americans through slavery, but we have also destroyed groups of people. And I'm referring here to Native American tribes. And often we forget about that. But that was another element that was brought out through eugenics. This idea of the white man's burden, the idea that those that are non-white and primitive must be either destroyed or assimilated. It's for their own good, you often hear. So the Nazis targeted different ethnicities. Remember, I told you there were non-Jewish victims. These included the Gypsies or Romas, and of course the Jews, nationalities, Slavs, including Poles and the Russians, what they called degenerates, which were homosexuals and those with physical and mental disabilities and intellectual disabilities, political rivals, including communists and socialists, and religious groups. We know, of course, about the Jews, but Jehovah's Witnesses were also considered unacceptable and were targets. And asocials, anyone who opposed the Nazis, were all targeted. So genocide was not the first step. Concentration camps upon their ascent to power on January 30th, 1933, the Nazis established concentration camps for the imprisonment of all enemies of their regime. Sentences could be for a few months or a few years. Now, these are not the concentration camps we think about with the Holocaust in terms of the Jewish ghettos. These were places where political dissidents, people that may cause trouble, quote unquote, people that may have done some sort of wrongdoing that isn't necessarily a local crime, but rather something that the Nazis considered a crime against the state. And sometimes it was for things that we mentioned above, like being gay, for example. And of course, everybody's famous remembers the Martin Niemöller poem. This was the one that's often misquoted, misattributed, and you've probably seen memes of this particular piece um, all over the place and attributed to everybody under the sun. This is the guy that actually said it. He was a German Protestant pastor, and he was a Nazi political prisoner from 1937 to 1945. He was not targeted in the Holocaust genocide exterminations, but he was rather considered an enemy of the state. And he said in his poem, of course, they came for the communists. I didn't object, for I wasn't a communist. They came for the socialists. I didn't object, for I wasn't a socialist. They came for the labor leaders, and I didn't object, for I wasn't a labor leader. They came for the Jews, and I didn't object, for I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to object. So there were markings at the camps. And again, this isn't necessarily the ghettos. These are the camps that were people were imprisoned. And these are just some of the markings that they would use. So political enemies had these red upside down triangles. And that was the basic one. And if they were repeat offenders, they had a line through, depending on how many repetitions. If they were inmates of penal battalions, they had a dot at the bottom. And if they were also Jews, they had a yellow triangle placed underneath of them. Now, this is a double thing. If they were Jews as well as political prisoners, not Jews by themselves, they all had just a yellow Star of David. All right. Then you had habitual criminals. They were green. Foreign forced laborers. These may be Africans, for example. They were blue. Religious dissidents. Again, this is not necessarily Jewish, but they might be as well. But these were religious dissidents, often Jehovah's Witnesses and others. Homosexuals and sex offenders were pink. And in fact, this is where the pink triangle comes from. And you'll see there's a document about the pink triangle and the paragraph 157 and what that meant. Asocials were black triangles, and Romas or gypsies were brown triangles. The other markings they would get, Jewish race defilers got a black line in theirs. Female race defilers, that was women that would that were married to someone with a different race. Escape suspects got a circle, and so on. So you can kind of see they were very well organized. That's for sure. Then they were worn on their shirts, like you see here. If there was more than one situation, this particular person was a habitual criminal, and there at least twice. Also Jewish, was from a penal battalion, escape suspect, and also penal battalion, and was an escape suspect. So you can see they could have a few different ones. Here's an actual one to show you that is one of the Jewish ones. And again, another paper, this one in German, that was explaining it to the Germans and showing them where these symbols would be placed. Here's again some concentration camp prisoners, and again, these aren't the Holocaust camps. These are just the camps they were keeping them in the beginning of the war, before the final solution. So I have camps. Essential to the Nazi systematic oppression and eventually for their mass murder of the enemies. They needed to separate these people from the general population for a number of reasons. One, it's much easier to get rid of people that have been isolated than to get rid of people that are your neighbors, particularly if you're going to get rid of them in such a way that the general population has knowledge. Um, it also allowed them to use them for slave labor. And in many cases, their ultimate goal was this annihilation by work, working them until they died. Um, and it also allowed them, it also allowed them to steal their property. So suddenly, if you were placed in a camp like that, they could confiscate your property. So 3 steps to the road to genocide. One is you can't live among us as Jews. So there was this again, and we're going to look at this in the road to Nuremberg, your next PowerPoint. You cannot, you have to separate the oppressed group from the general population so that they don't live among them, so that they're not your neighbors anymore. You cannot live among us, and then finally, you cannot live. So they start off with, you can't live as Jews. You can be around us, but you can't be Jewish. All right, no, that's not going to work. You can't be around us. No, that's not going to work. You need to be gone. The final solution. And the escalation of hate. And I think this is important because this is something we don't often think about. But this is what I want you to kind of think in your own head. Do you see the same escalation happening at other times? Because this is not something that only occurred in the road to World War II. This is something that has occurred all over the world, in all countries, at all times, including this day and age. Stereotyping. Oh, they are all whatever. Prejudice. Discrimination. They shouldn't work here. They shouldn't be allowed to do this. They're not allowed in this area. We don't serve those kind of people. Oh, they should wear this outfit, or they should be kneeling, or they should be speaking English. And then finally, institutionalized government-sponsored racism. Separation. Being put into concentration camps. Being isolated. Being targeted. Not by individuals, but by the government. And finally, genocide. You cannot live among us as Jews. And again, we're going to talk about Nuremberg laws in just a second. This was a prejudiced attitudes, stereotyping, discrimination, harassment, and finally, systematic racism. And this idea of you cannot live among us as Jews did not begin with the Nazis. This was something that had been in Europe, permeating Europe, for as long as Europe had been Christian. And as long as Jews have existed there. And this starts with anti-Semitism, which is a hostility toward or discrimination against Jews as a religious, ethnic, or racial group. And this is a caricature for an anti-Semitic Viennese, that's from Vienna, magazine. The Jews will try to conquer the world through a black market in grain. There's often this kind of black market conspiracy element that the Jews are trying to take over whatever sector of society they deem is worth being taken over. And as again, this is not new stuff. This is stuff that I've done. In fact, there is a theory out there that Christopher Columbus may actually have been Jewish, but at the time of his life in Italy, where he was originally from, you weren't allowed to be Jewish. It was against the law. So all Jews had to convert to Catholicism. So There is evidence that his family converted, but did not convert in their hearts, and that his trip to the New World was actually a goal of trying to find an easier route to transport the Jews in Italy out of Italy and into Israel. Some people even believe he took Jewish treasures with him. All right. The personification of the devil as the symbol of all evil assumes the living shape of the Jew, according to Adolf Hitler. And again, this was part of the propaganda, because in order for Hitler's final solution to work, we not only had to isolate that group of people, but we had to demonize them. They had to be hated. And that's another thing to think about when we're looking at the possibilities of repeating in history. Are there groups that become demonized, that become hated, that become called evil, and why? And Hitler's minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, that's him in the middle there, links the love of Germany with the hatred of Jews. You cannot live among us. And this is where part of where eugenics comes in. And it's loosely based, again, on this idea that people should be bred as farmers breed animals, deliberately weeding out inferior traits through genetic selection. Nazis believed they could create a master race. And that master race was Aryan. The Nazis believed that people of Northern European ancestry, especially those with blue eyes and blonde hair, were superior to all other people, including people of African, Asian, and Middle Eastern ancestry. In 1933, there were few people in Africa or Asia and ancestry living in Germany. There were, however, 500,000 Jews who seemed to threaten racial purity. And here's some of the propaganda pictures. Well, that's just a picture of Mein Kampf. There's a picture of a Hitler Youth. Look at those blonde hair there. And of course, the idea was the power of words. The greatest masses of people will more easily fall victim to a big lie than a small one. How fortunate for leaders that men do not think. The victor will never be asked if he told the truth. I believe today I am acting in the sense of the Almighty Creator. By warding off the Jews, I am doing the Lord's work. So, what do all these quotations have in common? Notice them. Great masses of people will more easily fall victim to a big lie than a small lie. How fortunate for leaders that men do not think. The victor will never be asked if he told the truth. I believe today I am acting in the sense of the Almighty Creator. By warding off the Jews, I am doing the Lord's work. So what do they all have in common? They were all said by Adolf Hitler. And of course, the propaganda was all over. He even had a Nazi children's board game where you try to get people off to Palestine and get rid of them. Okay, so how did they know who was Jewish? In November 1934, German churches began to collaborate with Nazis by supplying records indicating who was baptized Christian. State-of-the-art data processing, this is where IBM comes in, was used to take a census in all German territory. Early in the Nazis included questions on religious heritage. The machine allowed the Nazi officials to tabulate huge amounts of data very quickly. In 1934, Nazi scientists developed this kit, and you see an example here, which contained 29 samples of human hair. The samples were used by geneticists, anthropologists, and doctors to determine ancestry. Hair color also became a means to prove the supposed superiority of Aryans and the inferiority of Jews, Gypsies, and those of mixed breeds. And that was the quote they used. So here's our hair. And of course, art. The Eternal Jew, a degenerative art exhibit in Munich, and we've seen some of this degenerative art, opened in November 1937. The largest pre-war anti-Semitic exhibit produced by the Nazis. It depicted Jews as vile, subhuman creatures. The exhibit featured photographs pointing out typically Jewish traits. And the Jew is stereotyped as having a large hooked nose, enormous lips, and a sloping forehead. And here's one of the pictures. And there's another one about a documentary film. There is part of the exhibit, and you can see them emphasizing facial features. This is Germans are suspicious of Jews who are seen as conspiring with the help of communists to take over the world. So this is one of the great maps that the Germans used to show how they were all linked together. In April 1st, 1933, Hitler declared a one-day boycott of Jewish shops. Many Germans voluntarily participated. In May 1933, Jewish books were burned in public bonfires. And we're going to be looking closer at this, but we'll start here. The Nuremberg laws turned prejudice and discrimination into systematic racism. For example, in 1935, Jewish newspapers could no longer be sold. In 1936, Jews lost the right to vote. Very important. 1938, Jews had to surrender their driver's license and car registrations. The Nuremberg laws also classified degrees of Jewish blood. One use for this classification was to permit or to deny couples the right to marry and thus reproduce. One proposed solution to the Jewish problem was sterilization. By 1938, all Jews were required to carry identification cards. Jewish passports and papers were marked with the letter J. Here's one of our examples. Germans passed by broken shop windows of a Jewish-owned business that was destroyed during Kristallnacht in Germany, in Berlin, November 1938. That was a day where the entire country basically vandalized Jewish-owned shops. It was the purge. Many Jews attempted to leave Germany, but many nations, including Great Britain, Canada, and the U.S., limited Jewish immigration. And this is a picture in 1939, 850 Jewish refugees attempted to enter British-controlled Palestine illegally. British officials arrested the 850 European Jewish immigrants and interned them in the detention center near Haifa. Similarly, in 1939, the German refugee ship St. Louis attempted to find safe harbor for its Jewish passengers in Cuba and the U.S. Most ended up in Belgium and the Netherlands. Evacuating the Jews from Germany. Nazis created compulsory Jewish quarters in many Polish cities and towns. These are the ghettos. The ghettos that we know about. Were sections of the city where all Jews from the surrounding area were forced to reside, surrounded by barbed wire and walls. The Nazi ghettos were the first step, or the preliminary step, in the annihilation of Jews. Ghettos became transition areas used as collection points for deportation to concentration and death camps. You can see some of the ones that are established here, where there's a ghetto, where when it was established, and then where there's different occupations. In the spring of 1941, conditions inside the Poland Warsaw Ghetto were hellish. Food was scarce, clothing consisted of old rags, and medical supplies were virtually non existent. Child mortality rates skyrocketed. And this is an orphan sleeping. And there is an orphan probably dying by his sister. It's another one that's near death. In 1941, German Jews were taken into protective custody and deported to these concentration camps built inside eastern Germany and Poland. And this is a picture of Jews being deported from the German city of Bad-Baden. In response to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the Nazis destroyed the ghetto and moved the residents further east to safety. There was a rebellion in the Warsaw Ghetto, and they tried to get out. Jews carrying few of their remaining possessions to train stations, they were then transported in freight and cattle cars, not in regular train cars. This is important because there was this need to dehumanize them. So they put them in cattle cars. So not only were there no chairs, but the trains also had no sanitation options, no food, no water, and very little air. Concentration camps were built on railroad lines for efficient transportation. On arrival, all were given numbers. Some had their numbers actually tattooed on their wrists. By 1941, Roma also deported its Jews. Romania also deported its Jews, and 2,500 occupants of the were allowed to disembark for a few minutes. Burning and dehydrated, they immediately sought refuge in the cool mud before returning to the torture of the sealed rail cars. For the health and for the protection of hereditary health. Again, this idea was to improve the quality of the Germanic races. Nazi policy was to eliminate those that they called, quote, unworthy of life, unquote. These were mostly mentally and physically challenged to promote this racial integrity of the Aryan race. This policy halted in 1941 due to an outcry within Germany. So then they began doing the Einsatzgraben. These were mobile killing units, which had begun killing operations aimed at entire Jewish communities in the 1930s, thought to have killed as many as 1 million people in 6 months. Vigorous participation and local police helped facilitate the killings. However, as you can see, efficiency was not what Germans wanted. Their bodies were left in these huge ditches, and that became problematic. And they realized that might cause people to complain. So they needed a more efficient method. Fewer than half of the 2,500 Romanian Jews on the Lassie death train survived the 8-day trip due to exhaustion, starvation, dehydration, and suffocation. And most of the dead bodies were left in the train until it stopped, and then they were just taken out and dumped in a pit. In 1941, something I can't pronounce, in Ukraine, and members of the Einsatzkommando commandos, the local Ukrainian nationalists, murdered 25,000 Jews in a huge open pit. Mass chutes and graves in Estonia and Poland were inefficient and they demoralized the soldiers. So now the Germans began to think of a more permanent solution for their problem and something that would not have so many visible dead bodies. Thus, the final solution came. The code name for the plan to destroy the Jews in Europe. In December 1941, Jews were rounded up under the excuse of a resettlement program and sent to the death camps in the East. In July 19, July 31st, 1941, SS Major General Reinhard Heinrich was empowered to prepare a, quote, total solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe, end quote. This document did not specify what the solution would be, but it did permit him to handle the, quote, Jewish question, end quote, in ways that went beyond emigration and evacuation. Blonde and blue-eyed, Heinrich fit the Aryan ideal. And I think I've spelled Heydrich wrong. I will double check that. Heydrich conveyed the Wannsee Conference a meeting with the top Nazi officials in which plans to coordinate the quote-unquote final solution were outlined, ambushed by Czech resistance fighters near Prague. Heydrich died on June 4th, 1942. Germans took revenge by razing the Czech village of Ladice and killing all its male inhabitants. At the Wannsee Conference, SSF officer Adolf Eichmann was given the task of implementing the final solution. In an extreme efficient bureaucrat, Eichmann organized the rounding up and the train convoys, to the extermination camps. Heinrich observed that poison gas was already being used to exterminate the disabled. He devised the gassing procedure to set the death camp quotas in the extermination camps. Heinrich fled Germany for Buenos Aires. After the war in 1960, the Israeli government found him, kidnapped him, tried him in Israel, and hanged him. Taking place in the beautiful Wasin estate, the 1942 conference was attended by 15 men, 8 of whom had advanced university degrees ranging from law to philosophy and theology. Nearly all knew about the deportation and the killings already in progress. 10 days after the meeting, on January 30th, 1942, Hitler proclaimed that the result of this war would be the total annihilation of the Jews. By the way, if you want to see a wonderful film, there's an HBO film called The Final Solution, which is about this meeting in this estate. And it's beautifully done. Very disturbing. The leader of the SS and the head of all police forces, including the Gestapo Heinrich Himmler, that's him right here, spent much of 1943 implementing the final solution by using his control over the courts and civil service to advance the racial reordering of Europe. Himmler paid particular attention to the fate of the 600,000 Jews of France. When trying to pass a British checkpoint in May 1955, a fugitive was recognized and arrested. He bit a cyanide pill, dying in moments. The SS was put in charge of the day-to-day operations of the death camps. Many SS guards claimed just after the war that they had been, quote, following orders. Rudolf Huss, commander at Auschwitz, said, "We were also trained to obey orders without even thinking." Over the sign over the entrance to Auschwitz said, "Work makes one free." However, Auschwitz was not a labor camp. It was, in fact, a death camp. And these are the locations of concentration camps and death camps. And again, Buchenwald was known as a so-called concentration camp, but we know that that was also a death camp. The pile of clothes belonging to prisoners of the Dachau concentration camp most of it would be resold to German citizens. The Germans deported the Dutch Jews east starting in mid 1942. Most believed they were going to labor camps. Few believed the death camps even existed. Mauthausen labor camp at liberation in 1945. Note how relatively well fed and well dressed the inmates look. Compare the previous picture to this one showing the inmates of a death camp, many of whom were not immediately taken to gas chambers, died more slowly from malnutrition and overwork. So you have this one, a labor camp. It's mostly filled with political prisoners, and a death camp. Once selected, you began the process of extermination. Your luggage would be left for collection later. First, you remove all your valuables, including your wedding ring. Then you remove your shoes and clothes, eyeglasses, and some of the confiscated property was kept in storerooms nicknamed Canada. The sheer amount of loot stored there was associated with the riches of Canada. They removed hair, of course. They shaved you. And prisoners were sent to the gas chambers that were disguised as showers. Zyklon B gas used to gas people in 3 to 15 minutes. Up to 8,000 people were gassed per day in Auschwitz Birkenau, the largest death camp with 4 operating gas chambers. Gold fillings in the victims' teeth were taken out after their death, melted down to make gold bars. And then the prisoners themselves removed the dead bodies and put them in mass crematoriums. The gas chambers, disguised as showers, mainly used carbon monoxide and Zyklon B. To meet the daily death quota, the SS guards gassed men and women, the elderly, and children. The largest industrial ovens were used to cremate the remains, Jewish inmates operating the ovens under SS supervision. And here's some of the death tolls of the different. By 1954, the Nazis began to destroy crematoriums and camps as Allied troops closed it. Between 1944 and 1945, Nazis ordered marches over long distances. Approximately 250,000 to 375,000 prisoners perished in these death marches. In January 27, 1945, the Soviet army entered Auschwitz, which was the largest camp, and liberated the 7,000 remaining prisoners, who were mostly ill and dying. This is a corpse-laden cart. Allied soldiers liberating the camp often had to dig mass graves. And this is from the diary of Anne Frank. Here's Anne. In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. And she was a 15-year-old who died at Bergen-Belsen of typhus. When the British liberated Bergen-Belsen, April 15th, 1945, they discovered tens of thousands of unburied bodies. At 4 a.m. on April 29th, 1945, the last day of his life, Adolf Hitler made one last address to the German people, and he said, quote, "Above all, I charge the leaders of the nation and those under them to scrupulous observation of the laws of race and to the merciless opposition to the universal poison of all peoples, international Jewry." Even after the liberation, Bergen-Belsen inmates continued to die. 4,000 prisoners died from April 15th the June 20th in 1945, many from diseases that they got in the camps. Buchenwald in 1945, the human remains on the table included two shrunken heads and a lampshade allegedly made from human skin. The commandant's wife, Elsa Koch, kept a collection of tattooed human skin. Nazi doctors did high pressure experiments. That's this one here. And radiation experiments. So they would put people in high pressure situations to see how long they would live or what organs would fail or what they could do to try to prevent that. And this was seeing how much radiation a body could handle. In 1945, Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz. Rudolf Höss, commander of Auschwitz, was asked if the Jews whom he had murdered had in any way deserved their fate. He answered, quote, "Don't you see we're SS men? We're not supposed to think about those things. Besides, it was something already taken for granted that the Jews were to blame for everything." End quote. Again, the need for a scapegoat is so important. The Jewish population in Europe in 1933 was 9,508,340. Estimated survivors of the Holocaust, 3,546,211. In October 1942, the armed revolt and escape attempt closed the camp. And in October 1944, Auschwitz inmates revolted but failed to achieve their goal, the destruction of the gas chambers. Oskar Schindler, you may have heard of him, a German businessman who first profited from the war but who later saved over 1,300 Jews from the gas chambers by declaring them essential workers regardless of their age or capacity to work. November 22nd, 1945, the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal began. This is when the United Nations took Germany to task for their humanitarian problems. And there were some survivors. And there was a promise to never again. All right. So that's the road up. I have more for you. We'll be looking next at the Nuremberg laws. These are the laws that helped establish the ways of making Jews non-human. Think about some of the race laws, particularly what Walter Pickler wanted to do in Virginia. And you really get to see the eugenics influence.